Brian, are we ready? Oh, we're ready. Welcome to A Journey Through NYC Religion. That was Brian Finnerty, our producer. We have a great crew that helps us get here. We have Carmen that's keeping track of our time. We have Carla who's sort of set up things here and guides us through the studio, and Ann and Edie and Sam. It's a great crew, and we're really grateful for them. A Journey Through NYC Religion this time is going to talk about the making of a new church. Why are we doing this? Recently, there have been numerous headlines about the decline of Christianity in America. These stories were set off by a recent published study by the Pew Research Center, which cataloged a drop in church affiliation mainly among the children of the religiously weak baby boomers. The local media have been caught up in this and have been accompanying these stories with a drumbeat of stories about church closings and church buildings being sold off. There are rashes of stories of the rise of the non-religious. Atheist organizations are pouring money into persuading journalists to report on their successes. For some journalists, it's sweet music to their ears. In the last months, our largest local newspaper carried not one story about the founding of a new church or a new congregation of another religion. Not one. There are many, many stories about the opening of new businesses, the opening of new plays, new movies, new books, new fashions, new candidates, and new social movements, but not one story in the last couple of months about the opening of a new church. So, we thought we need to fill the gap in this news reporting. Let's find a story of making a new church. Well, you didn't have to look very far. Right next to our studio, just a few doors down, is the offices of the leaders of one new church plant. Can you believe it? You throw a rock in this city and you'll hit a new church going up. How hard it is to report on that story? Well, today we're going to give you one example from the same street that our studio is on. Its founders are Reverend Justin Ardour and his wife Ang. Welcome to Journey TV.
Thank you for having me.
You know, tell us a little bit about this new church you're founding here in East Harlem.
Yeah, so we are our new congregation here in the neighborhood. We have been making plans for this for about the last year or so. We just recently started public worship services about a month ago. But we're part of a bigger church planting organization. Our sending church is part of a larger church here in the city.
Redeemer Presbyterian Church?
Redeemer Presbyterian Church, yeah.
Now, I hear a lot about this church in involvement in church planning, and I think they have another organization, a sister organization called Redeemer City to City.
That's right.
What's going on with Redeemer? Why is it having this impact?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, historically, Redeemer has been a very influential church, I mean, both here in the city and around the world. And one of the things that has been most influential is that Redeemer's had a very high emphasis on starting new churches. Started here in New York, certainly grew regionally, and now they're involved in starting churches literally all over the world. And so that big emphasis has been very influential as they work with all different types of denominations and churches. And so because of that, they've had a very broad influence, and Redeemer's been very much a part of that.
This is the church that Tim Keller was founded.
That's right, yes. Yes, so Tim Keller is a very well-known author and preacher, and he's really been able to use that kind of influence that he's had in that arena to also benefit some of these church planting movements that have been starting. So.
You know, I think this is something that we don't realize here in New York, how New York is influencing the world of religion all over the world. Just last week, I ran across a group of I hosted a group of Brazilian scholars and city councilmen and the like from Rio de Janeiro. And they were talking about a church conference that was hosted in Rio, I think it was in Rio, that was hosted by Redeemer Presbyterian Church here in New York City. I you will run across this phenomenon around the world, that New York has actually become a great religious center for the world, of founding religious organizations, not only churches, but also mosques and synagogues and so forth around the world. Now, I'm wondering, how did you get into this? They call it church planting. It's sort of like you put a seed in the ground and a church pops up. It's sort of a peculiar language, but it makes sense. So the Johnny Appleseed, and you're one of the Johnny Appleseeds. But when you grew up as a kid, some kids want to grow up to be president. Some kids want to grow up to start their new IBM. Did you grow up and say, oh, I'm going to plant a church?
No. No. Planting a church, starting a church, whatever language might work, was not on my radar as a kid. I do come from a ministry family, so my dad is a pastor, my grandfather was a pastor, my great-great-grandfather was a pastor, and my great-great-great-grandfather was a pastor. It's kind of the family business. And so ministry was very much, obviously, in the water of the world that I was swimming in. Did
that give you an advantage when you start to think about planting a church? Did that background give you an advantage, or was it a disadvantage?
Yes and no. There's certainly advantages to it, right? So you come into ministry having an understanding, some kind of framework for knowing what ministry looks like. Right. But there's also, the world that we live in today is very different than the world that my dad lived in or my grandparents lived in. And with the new world comes new challenges and new ways of thinking about how ministry happens and functions. And so that might be where some of the deviation occurs.
Now you're not starting this church as a branch of your father's church.
Sure.
You're starting as a sort of a spin-off from Redeemer. Mm-hmm. That sounds like there's a sort of a difference in direction there. What happened?
Yeah, I think the difference would just largely be Redeemer was the church body that we found ourselves in. It's a church that we've loved dearly, and the pastors and Tim Keller, of course, have been very influential for us just personally. And so as we came into working for Redeemer several years ago, it was through that time that we were there that starting a church through Redeemer became a thing. So it wasn't necessarily something we were intending to do by coming to Redeemer. It was ultimately what happened, but it wasn't something we were intending on.
When did you think about that? I'd like to start a church someday. Yeah. When did that take place?
And my wife and I probably started some of the initial conversation about it probably about 10 years ago now. Something like that.
Well, how does that start? You one day come up to your wife and says, let's go found a church.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah.
I'm curious about that process.
Yeah, thinking back on it, I think there were a lot of things as we began talking about it. You always try to assess the motivations for wanting to do something like that, whether or not you're actually prepared to do something like that. And I don't remember what started, like when the first conversation happened and what the catalyst for it was. But we did know it was something that was kind of on the horizon, but we knew we were not there yet. There were just a lot of things that we felt like we needed in order to do it well.
What did you need?
Yeah, I think I was, in hindsight, I was certainly young, too young, I think. That might not have been the case for everybody, but I think for me, I had a lot to learn about ministry, about loving and caring for people, those kinds of things, just a maturity type of thing. And so spending time growing and learning was very important for us. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever we did best we could. And so that was important to us to wait.
When did it start to become a reality?
So it became a very focused reality probably 3 years ago, where it was starting to be clear that we were getting to a point that we felt like we were mature enough, we'd learned enough that we could probably do this well.
Well, who started saying this first, yourself or your wife, Ang?
I think the two of us felt very confident around the same time. Again, I don't know that there was any kind of explicit one person was before the other. We talk about these things all the time. She's not only my wife, also my best friend. And so we just talk about these things ongoing. So I don't even know when that turn actually happened, but it was probably about 3 years ago.
Well, how do you know when it's right for you that to go found the church? It's a huge task.
Yeah.
It means many things. You're giving up your ability to make millions. You're going to make paltry
Sure.
amount. There are a few churches that maybe make that, but it's not in New York.
Yeah.
The main run is much
that's
less.
Right. That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, most pastors are just pastors who love people, love their communities, love their neighborhoods, and they don't make a penny off of it. So some might get some bad press around making money off of ministry, but no, that was certainly not the case.
Almost half of churches are pastored by the people that are bivocational.
That's right.
That is, they cannot possibly, and maybe don't even make any money from the church, but they have another job and they do the church in their off hours.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, for us, I think the things that we felt like we needed, was partly the motivation. Why do we want to do this? And I think for us, it was a real desire to just really love and serve our community well, and felt like we'd gotten to a place that we could do that well. To love and care for people well, and so to be able to journey with people.
What does it mean to love and care for people well? That sounds very abstract.
Sure. Well, people are, we're complex beings. There are certain struggles, there are certain joys, there are certain experiences that people have, and as a Christian pastor, I believe that the Christian faith, the gospel message, has a lot to offer people.
Well, give me an example of where you've helped somebody.
Yeah. I've walked with people through just real sickness, death, and when you're in those kinds of moments, as an example, again, we just believe that the Christian faith has a lot to say about those kinds of things, and having hope beyond the struggles and sicknesses of this life. Is part of what it means to pastor. It's part of what it means to journey with people. And so being people in, again, their lowest of times and their greatest joys is really what it means to be a pastor and to care for people. So. Well,
there's lots of needs in the world, but why New York City, and specifically, why East Harlem?
Yeah, great question. You're absolutely right. Wherever there is need and wherever there are people, there ought to be churches who are seeking to care for those people, care for those communities. And as far as East Harlem goes, actually to New York, one of the interesting things about the world we live in now is that we're rapidly urbanizing. That's been happening for globally, just rapidly urbanizing. People are flocking to cities. And we are of the conviction that God loves people, and so wherever the people are, that's where we want to be. So that would be maybe one answer to the city's question in New York. East Harlem, this is where we live. This is where we've been we've been right here in the neighborhood for several years, for going on 4 years now.
You've lived here for a while.
Yeah, so we've lived in East Harlem for the last 4 years. Before that, we lived in the Bronx, where I was pastoring as well, before being at Redeemer.
And that's where your father's church is?
Yes, so my father pastors a church up in Castle Hill, Parkchester area of the Bronx. So I worked with him for a number of years before we ultimately ending up here in East Harlem. And so it's just a community that God's really kind of knit our hearts with this community. We love this community. It's where we're raising our family. And
well, knit your hearts and you love. What about this community do you love?
Yeah.
Specifically, you can say people, but
yeah.
What about people? What do you really love about this community?
This is a beautiful, vibrant family. If you ever spend any time in East Harlem, it's a very family-oriented, tight-knit community. It's actually within the landscape of New York. There's certainly tight-knit communities, but East Harlem really is a unique kind of neighborhood where there's still just this very heavy family emphasis. So that's one thing that we've always loved about this neighborhood. It's also a complicated neighborhood, especially in more recent days. It's a changing neighborhood, and so some of the concerns and tensions that might come as a result of that.
Well, let me back up for a moment.
Sure.
Okay, tight-knit.
Mm-hmm.
You're originally from the outside, so
Sure.
how do you get into a tight-knit neighborhood?
Yeah, I think time. There's really no easy, quick way to do that. Part of it is just spending time.
Did you ever have a breakthrough where you say, oh, I'm beginning to be accepted?
Over this last year, I have been so incredibly honored by the ways that other pastors, other community leaders, other organizations that have been serving this neighborhood for many, many, many years. I've been so honored at the way that they have been welcoming to us.
How do they welcome you? I mean, do they just say, hi, there's good coffee over there, or some other way?
Yeah, no, we've had very tangible opportunities to serve together. So one example, where I office right now is in a church that has been serving 104th Street for literal generations. And I office in their space. They've given me opportunities to serve in their space. I've built a friendship with their pastor and gotten to know their people and the different organizations that are part of their group. So that's one example.
I thought churches were supposed to always be stabbing each other in the back and territorial.
Sure. Well, it's unfortunate that might happen sometimes, but again, we really have been so honored by the open-handedness. We've also been a part of, again, just another example, over this past year, we were part of a mentorship group that pulled together several churches from the neighborhood, along with a really amazing organization called Exodus Transitional Community. We got to be a part of a mentorship program, and again, that we were welcomed into to help kind of put that on and serve that group of people.
So your church meets sort of in between your office down here and that Exodus Transitional Program.
We do, yeah.
Where do y'all meet, and when do you meet?
Yeah. We meet right smack dab in the middle of East Harlem. So at 116th and Lexington, we meet just in between Lexington and Park. Anybody that knows 116, there's a laundromat there. Laundromat, bar, and then we meet at a space right above that. If you ever come by on a Sunday, you'll see our signs out there, 10 a.m. But we've been meeting there for the last month, and it's been great.
So audience, you can come there and drop off your laundry, go to church, and get a drink on the way out.
Yeah, you can.
I don't know what the pastor here would say about that.
I'll join you.
Okay. Well, and next we'll ask him if he'll do the treating. Well, what is unique? One of the things you say about East Harlem, that it's very tightly knit together.
Sure.
How do you see that playing out in people's lives? And where does a church fit to help that knitting in many ways?
Sure. Yeah, I think for us, and I can really only just speak specifically to the work that we're trying to do.
Fair enough.
We are a church that, our congregation right now, we've been meeting together as a group in preparation for about a year. Again, we've only been in public worship services for the last month. But as a group, we have a group of people it's very diverse. It's diverse, ethnically, but it's also diverse in the fact that we've got people that were born and raised in the neighborhood. We've also got people that are relatively new to the neighborhood. Maybe they've been here for a good length of time, but they aren't native to here. And then we've got others that are new, very new to the neighborhood. And it's a space where I think we've curated the space where all of them feel welcome. So that's a very unique kind of thing.
How do you make all of that disparate group, you say curated the space?
Yeah.
What does that mean? You put up pictures on the wall that's for each group, or what does curation in that situation mean?
Well, a couple things. I think one, we have a very heavy neighborhood orientation. So one of the interesting things about coming from Redeemer, who's again a very large church, very regional church, people have been coming, as far as Connecticut down to come to church services. It's been a very regional kind of thing. Over the years, Redeemers recognized that's not actually the best way to serve a city. And so over the last 10 years or so, they've slowly been moving away from that centralized idea. And our church now in this next season and chapter of Redeemer is very neighborhood oriented. So there's a reason why we are Redeemer East Harlem. The idea just being that we want to focus all of our attention here in the neighborhood. And so to your question, one of the things that we've tried to emphasize is that we are going to be a church that is for this community, not just in the community. It's actually relatively easy to be a church that's just in the neighborhood. Yeah. It's very different to be a church that's for the neighborhood. To be for the neighborhood means that you are learning the concerns, the joys, the sorrows, just you're trying to understand that neighborhood well. And by doing that, what it's done is it's brought people from those different spaces and places, backgrounds, together, because I think whether you're someone who's new or someone that's been here for a long time, because we've tried to emphasize so much the neighborhood, when you come in, it's something familiar to you.
You are one of a number of younger pastors that have been influenced by Tim Keller.
Yeah.
Can you describe to our audience about what were your first impressions of Pastor Keller, and then over time when you served on his staff, how that changed and deepened in various ways?
Sure. I mean, yeah, so Tim Keller is a very well-known preacher and author, and the thing that he's probably most known for is what would be called apologetics, so making arguments for the Christian faith. One of his books, The Reason for God, was a New York Times bestseller, and so that is really what catapulted him. And so, of course, that was kind of drawn to that. I think there's a younger group of people that are very drawn to that type of thing.
That type of thing meaning what?
Just more of the intellectual arguments for the Christian faith.
So you actually encountered Reverend Keller through his books before you ever met him?
So I first met him, or came across him at a men's gathering actually here in the city years ago, way before I ever knew he was a thing. Actually, he blew my mind this one day, and I went home and I Googled him and realized, oh, he's kind of a thing. And so from that point on, just my wife and I started ingesting everything that we could, his
Do you
sermons
recall
and books.
what he blew your mind
yeah,
about?
No, he spoke on this was almost 10 years ago now, the jealousy of God. He spoke like this little 20-minute sermonette unpacking the jealousy of God, which seems like this weird, like why would God be jealous? Most people are just confused by that idea, but his idea was, when you think about jealousy, for example, in terms of a husband and a wife, if a husband feels like his wife is drifting from him, there's this jealousy that might be there, and that's actually a good jealousy because it's a jealousy that causes him to pursue her, and that jealousy of God is really it's out of God's love for us, wanting to be, again, close to us. Anyway, the whole thing was just brilliant. And so blew my mind, Google him, start intaking everything that I could, discover that he's not just intellectual as in, arguments for the Christian faith, but also the way that he taught Scripture. Just this idea that all of Scripture is, ultimately about Jesus and pointing to Jesus. This was a very new kind of way of approaching Scripture that just, again, blew my mind. And, now, to the other part of your question, coming on staff with him, or coming on staff with Redeemer, having some time with him. I mean, I've had a lot of time at this point with him, but just getting to know him, he's an incredibly humble and gracious man, which, for quote-unquote celebrity pastors, I don't know if that's always the case, but he just really was this just very humble man, which has been really a beautiful thing to see kind of up close and personal, that he is this globally renowned preacher and author who has started one of the more important movements, global movements in the Christian world right now, and yet he's just this incredibly humble person.
I think Time Magazine named him one of their 50 most important people in the United States of the year, or something like that.
Yep.
But he doesn't act like he's one of the 50 most important people.
Not in the slightest.
And holds Bible studies with presidents and stuff like that.
Right.
In fact, he doesn't talk about that at all, really.
No, that's exactly right. And so it's those kinds of things that I think really endear you to a person ultimately, because it shows a depth of character that that's important for a young pastor to be able to see and emulate. And so I've been grateful for that.
Now, there are different types of pastors. They're equally good.
Sure.
But they're very different. You have, I think we met the first time was when Luis Palau, the evangelist, was here.
Sure.
And he's more of the old crusade, Billy Graham type style.
Yeah.
But he's very different from Pastor Keller. How would
Sure.
you contrast them in 3 or 4 words?
Yeah, I think ultimately different contexts. So Tim is pastoring on the Manhattan, historically known as this secular kind of world, and so he's had to appeal to a certain demographic. Luis Palau has just been in a different context, coming from, I'm forgetting where he was. Argentina, yeah. That's just a different context than, Manhattan. And so I think the approach has largely just been the reflection of that, their different approaches to ministry and preaching. So.
Another thing that I know that Tim has done that's different, there's a different DNA to the Redeemer Church from other churches that were founded in the city before them. What's
Sure.
that DNA of Redeemer Presbyterian Church?
Sure. I think one of the things that, again, some of the things that Redeemer's been most known for, it has been church planting, and so a heavy emphasis there, a heavy emphasis on mercy and justice, so supporting the work of those that are doing a lot of advocacy in the city. And then the other thing was was what we call faith and work, that there is this bridging of these two worlds that can sometimes feel distinct in a person's life, that there's actually a marrying of faith and work that ought to happen in a person's life, that so they don't see them as mutually exclusive things.
Now, you say social justice. Is he one of the social gospel pastors?
Tim?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that term, it depends on how you define that term.
Well, I'm throwing it
You're
out there to
pushing
trip
on a
you
hot
up
button
bit.
issue, yeah. That is a hot button issue in a lot of our circles. He is a guy who believes in social justice and a guy who believes in the gospel, and we believe that those things are not separate things, that there really is, the gospel has a lot to say about social issues. And so however you define social gospel, I don't know. I don't want to speak for Tim.
Well, I think that's all that we will push Justin on, and we won't get him in any more trouble. Thank you very much.